Patrick Daly here, and welcome to episode number 14 of For the Week That's In It. So this week I was listening to a podcast recording of the late Alan Watts, who was a writer, speaker and philosophical entertainer who died many years ago now, back in 1973. And in this recording, which was titled We as Organism, Watts was referring to how in the Western philosophical tradition we tend to have a very narrow and myopic sense of the self as being quite distinct and separate from the environment. And he went on to explain how this sense of distinctness and separateness can lead to alienation from the world and even from our own bodies, and a kind of constant battling against the world and the body sometimes. So the world out there is viewed as the other, as the threat, the enemy, something to be dominated and controlled. And then he goes on to contrast this perspective with that of some other philosophical traditions where the sense of self is much wider and deeper and viewed as more integrated within and connected to the living world in which every self exists. So in this view, the world out there is not really out there at all, but it's rather just a continuation of the self through connection and relationship. And therefore there's no need to battle against it, but rather to adapt and swim with it. So in this view, we see ourselves as organisms integrated into a living whole. And this contrast between the two philosophical traditions reminded me a little bit of the way business has evolved over recent decades. So if we think back to the 1970s and before, many businesses were highly vertically integrated, and probably the classic example of this was the Ford Motor Company that controlled its entire production process, from mining the ore to growing the rubber to manufacturing the parts, assembling the parts, and even the high street retailing of their motor cars. And back in those times it was quite typical for functions even like cleaning, catering, distribution and delivery transport, and all manner of functions and activities to be owned and operated by the corporation itself. It was clear and unambiguous, but it was quite rigid, inflexible and monolithic. So today's successful business is much more likely to be so because of the quality of its myriad connections and relationships rather than its ownership of all of those means. And the modern business has established and maintains a multiplicity of supply chain partners through contracts, alliances, joint ventures and so on. And it holds just the strategically critical competences within the ownership of the core. And these businesses today operate in a manner much more akin to a living integrated organism in complex supply chains. So their supply chain partners will often consist of a plethora of suppliers, service providers, contract manufacturers, distributors and retail partners. And often the boundaries between the corporation and the partners become blurred and quite ambiguous in some cases. So these obviously are much more complex arrangements, and more so as these relationships must be adjusted to place and time in an ongoing manner, particularly in internationalized businesses. So consequently, the ability to fashion, to implement and manage these relationships effectively is a key competitive differentiator in today's international supply chains. And this requires an understanding of risk and security. It requires the development of sophisticated communications and relationship building skills to maintain and nurture the trust, monitor the threats, and strategize and reconfigure on a constant and ongoing basis. So it requires very different sets of skills and capabilities from those that were needed in the old days of vertical integration. So I'll leave you today with this question to ponder. How well adapted is your organization to the modern challenge of operating in the world, in the supply chain, as a living integrated organism? So that's it for this episode. See you back here next week for some more tips and insights on For the Week That's In It. Take care.